Good afternoon. We're going to get ready to start here with our keynote session. We'd appreciate if everybody would please find a seat, get settled in for the next 90 minutes or so. I'll very briefly repeat my welcome to folks. Thanks all for coming out. We're drying out today in Texas. We know our students are going to have to come and go for a little bit, but we'd appreciate some stability for the next few minutes. As I mentioned this morning, we're extremely grateful that our keynote speaker and other prominent panelists agreed to travel to Texas for our symposium today. We're also grateful that they've been frank in sharing their comments and discussing with us the most serious challenges confronting U.S. intelligence. We're doubly fortunate today. One of Austin's most distinguished residents has agreed to stop by and introduce our keynote speaker. You all, I guess I have to apologize there because where I come from, you and all are two separate words. So I'm sorry about that. You all will likely recognize, sitting in the front row, John Cornyn, senior senator from the state of Texas. And the majority whip in that chamber. But more relevant for today's purposes, you should know about Senator Cornyn that he's an incredibly strong supporter of this university, the Strauss and the Clements Centers, and our Intelligence Studies Project, and we're grateful for that. He's also a conscientious and serious-minded member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He brings to this event expertise in the topic we're addressing. And finally, the senator is a friend, former Senate colleague of our keynote speaker. So please welcome for the introduction of our keynote speaker, Senator John Cornyn.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be with all of you today. Thank you for having me. I do want to tell you how much I appreciate the great work being done by the Clements and Strauss Center and this intelligence project. I think it's really one of the crown jewels of the nation, and I'm just so excited that it's off to such a great start, and it attracts such incredible expertise and talents, people like my friend Dan Coates. As the Director of National Intelligence, of course, the perspective he has is unique and invaluable, and I can't pretend to touch the depth of his knowledge and insight. But I can tell you that as a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence myself, I do appreciate the challenges that he has to deal with and that we as a nation have to deal with on a daily basis. And I know Director Coates' comments will pique the interest of all of you, including the students here today, wondering about what your future, what might be in your future. And I hope that some of you will even consider a career in the intelligence community. Working in the community is a high calling. It is difficult, sometimes dangerous, but enormously important and rewarding. And we need patriotic, principled, and bright young people to bolster the ranks. So much for the advertisement. In the national security arena, what we're seeing right now is that the rules of the game seem to be changing right before our eyes. International conflict in the 21st century is evolving rapidly and is more complex than ever. It doesn't seem like there's a clear division between war and peace. If not a Cold War, what we're seeing is getting awfully chilly. Increasingly, there's information and economic warfare, as well as shocking acts of violence by terrorist groups. Their intent is to disrupt our way of life and to subvert our democracy and sow chaos in the global order. Before I got on the Intelligence Committee, I admit I didn't fully appreciate this. I didn't understand the frequency and severity of this shadow warfare. I didn't comprehend that some online spaces and some business transactions represent a new modern battlefield. Unfortunately, the threats are all around us, and they're close by, even when we're not necessarily aware of them. To show what I mean, I just want to mention quickly 3 real-world examples, all of which are public. The first involves a guy we'll just call Evgeny. That's his first name. According to news reports, he lived in New York and worked at a bank, a Russian bank. It turned out that Afghani wasn't your average banker. He was an operative working on behalf of the Russian government focused on economic intelligence. He gathered information on high-frequency trading on the New York Stock Exchange, and he studied alternative energy sources. Thankfully, he was arrested for espionage. He pled guilty and was sent back home. But in the shadow world that we live in today, Russia's involvement is more than just the news stories that we see about the past presidential election. Some of the investigations in Washington, of course, remain ongoing, but what we need to do is have an understanding of what's going on and what we need to do to combat them. Some of my colleagues have already introduced some legislation in response to our ongoing investigation into Russian meddling into the last election and taken important steps, baby steps in my view, to strengthen our cybersecurity response. One additional way that I've tried to add to that help is by reforming what's known as the Foreign Agents Registration Act. A bill I've introduced would provide greater public transparency with regard to foreign governments getting involved in our lobbying efforts of the United States government. It would do this by eliminating loopholes in the current system and improving the relevant online databases. And I think it's noteworthy that as a result, I think, of the special counsel's investigation and some of his activities, not only has RT, but Sputnik have registered as foreign agents. Pretty remarkable when you think about it, ostensibly news organizations registering as agents of a foreign government. The second example I'll mention is a Chinese medical student by the name of Zhao. According to news reports, Zhao lived in snowy Wisconsin, not exactly a hotbed for spies. But it turned out that he may have been stealing research from a cancer institute there and shipping it off to China. He was arrested and pled guilty to a charge associated with that theft. This sort of theft is happening more and more often, and where China is involved, it's not just in the context of academic research. Problems arise when China obtains our technology and know-how and uses it against us, particularly in the national security space. And we've been working to reform another important protection for the country, and that is the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. CFIUS helps us make sure that foreign investments, which are generally a good thing, that some strategic foreign investments don't jeopardize our national security. And I've introduced legislation with Senator Feinstein, a former chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee and a senior member of the Democratic Party, that would address a number of the ways foreign actors who aren't our friends circumvent our scrutiny. The bill would close gaps in existing law and authorize exemptions for our global allies. And this will ensure that foreign countries don't cheat by exploiting loopholes in the process. The last person I'll mention before I talk about the real person I'm up here to introduce is a driver of a shuttle bus in Denver by the name of Zazi. When he wasn't driving the bus, he was talking to some of his contacts back in Pakistan, who were affiliated, as it turned out, with al-Qaeda. Zazi wanted to detonate bombs in the New York City subway, but thankfully he was caught, and those bombs never went off. What led to his capture was a legal tool that allows for the collection of information like that sent by Zazi's friends in Pakistan to him in the United States. That tool, as many of you know, perhaps all of you know, is authorized by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. And with the director's help, we were able to reauthorize this critical tool earlier this year. Dan Coates was a big reason why we were able to do that, because of his integrity and the confidence people have in him and his judgment. Members of the Senate and the House were willing to support a reauthorization of Section 702. Without his help, we wouldn't have been able to get it done, and the American intelligence community would have lost its crown jewels. As those three examples indicate, the threats to our nation are diverse. There are Russian bankers, Chinese thieves, and terrorists like the bus driver in Denver. Dan Coates is a man who understands all of these threats and many others deeply. With the weight of the entire intelligence community behind him, he pushes back against these threats 24/7, and his leadership greatly benefits our nation's security. I'll just remind you that his resume is as impressive as his character. He served in the United States Army, he served in the House of Representatives, and then in the United States Senate twice. He left and then came back at the end treaties of, mine among others, when we're glad he did. He also served in the interim as the ambassador to Germany, and then was nominated by President Trump and confirmed as the Director of National Intelligence this last spring. So without further ado, let me present to you a man I greatly admire and respect, my friend and former colleague in the Senate, Dan Coats.
Well, my thanks to John Cornyn, not only for the privilege I've had in serving with him in Congress and watching his leadership, essential leadership over the years, a truly great American patriot representing your state in an extraordinary way, but also a good friend. John is responsible for recruiting me back into the Senate. I thank him for that most days, with a few exceptions. But what a privilege it has been to serve with him, and a privilege to be here with all of you. We had a wonderful dinner last evening. Admiral McCraven and his wife hosted that. In that dinner were people who have provided service to this country in extraordinary ways. It was like a Hall of Fame intelligence officers reunion. Several of them are sitting here. I won't start going through all the names because I'm afraid I'll miss somebody, but it's the people that I have had respect for throughout my career in the Senate and in Washington, and particularly now as Director of National Intelligence, and looking at the people who have spent their careers providing this nation with the intelligence necessary to keep our people safe. It's extraordinary accomplishments, and they are in this room. And I thank them for laying the path for someone like me who comes out of a policy career into an intelligence career without nearly the experience that they had. But I inherit what they have laid down in a lot of the people that are there that had served for them, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity. Austin obviously was on the minds of everyone just not that many days ago. I was with Director Wray, who was briefing me on that situation and how it came to conclusion. It serves as an example of the kind of information sharing and intelligence efforts that we need, working together through the federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to deal with situations like this. It literally was a surge here of federal, state, and local police that resulted in finally, actually fairly quickly, resolving this issue. Condolences obviously go to the victims of that, but it is an example of how we are needing to coordinate our efforts. And that is really the role of the intelligence community. And the Office of Director of National Intelligence is the office that was spun up after 9/11 to accomplish that very goal, and that is to provide that integration of efforts so that we are presenting the full picture. I kind of look at it like it's putting a puzzle together. We have 16 agencies that collect different ways intelligence from foreign entities that want to do us harm. And we try to incorporate all that information that we gather into a picture, a complete picture. Now, some agencies put more pieces of that puzzle than other agencies, but each agency plays a role, whether it's defense intelligence agencies or other agencies that we have from different intelligence groups that we have from other agencies. Each piece is necessary to complete the full puzzle. And that is what we present to the President of the United States and to our policymakers and our national security team so that they have the complete picture as we can put together to provide them the basis on which they then conduct their strategy and put their policy efforts together to address the threats that we have. Now, speaking of threats, I inherited a situation where the level of diversity of threats that has spread around the world has never been greater. The challenge that faces the intelligence community now is global. If you hired a jet to take you around the world, and you were required to stop at every place where there is a major conflict in place or about to be in place, you would be making a lot of landings. Because as you go around the globe, we see conflicts, flares burning in virtually every continent in the world. And much of that is directed toward the United States. Nobody likes the New York Yankees. I hope I'm not offending anybody because they always use... because they were the big guys in the room in baseball. So we're the target. We are the target because we've been trying to do good around the world and insert ourselves into resolving some of these conflicts. But hopefully, what we do is help the American public understand why we're there, why we need to do what we do, and frankly, folks. This is a secrets business. We do have respect, great respect for transparency, great respect for the rights of Americans as guaranteed them by our Constitution, the privacy of Americans, but we also owe them the common defense. We also owe them providing security for their people, for our families, for generations. And many, many sacrifices have been made by many, many people to allow us to keep these privileges available to all of us. But I'm really pleased to be here today to speak to you briefly in terms of how we have structured or plan to structure the agency going forward. I stopped at Baylor on the way down to talk to students and look at their program and do some recruiting. But arriving here in Austin and looking at the program that is put together by Steve Slick's leadership is extraordinary. The way UT has taken on the responsibilities of providing to students the opportunities to be in public service, to look at foreign service, or to look at the intelligence agencies and their interest in joining in public service is one of the main reasons why I wanted to be here. Had a wonderful meeting out at Dell this morning in terms of the relationships between Dell and UT. How Austin has become a go-to place for companies like Dell and others, a go-to place for developing young people's skills to provide service to their government in very critical and needed ways. So my kudos to UT and to particularly this program, Steve, for all that you do and all that has been accomplished here and will be accomplished as you continue to expand this program. Had a wonderful time to have lunch with these students here. I always learn more from students, I think, than anybody else. There's no filter in terms of what they want between their thoughts and what they say, and that's very refreshing, and that's what we need. So anyway, now more than ever, because of all these threats, we need a vibrant, dynamic, and creative intelligence community that is adaptive and resourceful and able to detect changing or emerging threats from a variety of actors. And I'd like to talk about just a few of the key threats that we face. The perpetual challenge that we're facing with North Korea, whose WMD program, defiance of the international community, military posturing, cyber activities, and potential for internal instability pose an increasing threat to the United States and our allies, and I think we're all aware of that. Now, while some recent developments offer some glimpse of a positive resolution to the conflict with North Korea, I'm one who believes that we need to be clear-eyed and very sober about the reality of this situation. I've been around long enough to have been in the mix of efforts that have been taking place to address the North Korea race toward nuclearization. Back in '94, there was a framework that was initiated by the Clinton administration, which North Korea had agreed to adhere to. They did not. Those of us that were in the Senate at the time were assured by the administration that we had all the verification programs and devices in place to make sure that they would not breach their agreement. That all failed. It was breached. The promises were broken. Once again, then, starting with the Bush administration and even into the Obama administration, the six-nation talks and the six countries involved over a 6-year period of time ended in dismal failure because, once again, the North Koreans wanted to talk, buy time, but not enforce and not to come to any agreement. So as we enter into this third iteration of dealing with North Korea, I do think eyes wide open, sober understanding of what the reality is, with hopes for the best, but real concerns in terms of whether or not we'll be able to achieve a good resolution to this issue, and North Korea will denuclearize as they said they might want to do. So that's an ongoing challenge. Obviously, we have a challenge with Russia, their recent past, and their continued activity work to undermine Western democracies, including ours, and this brazen use of poison to assassinate or attempt to assassinate a foreign agent of theirs, as well as other violations that they've made to the U.S. Convention on Chemical Weapons, demonstrates a real disregard for life, and we have responded to that. As you all have read and heard, we initiated a significant program in which to send their agents home. We were joined by our Western allies. We were joined by other nations around the world. I think the numbers will continue going forward. The Soviets have retaliated just today by announcing that they would release a equivalent reciprocal number to what we have done. That's to our benefit because there's a lot more Russians in America than there are Americans in Russia in the intelligence agency. We've also closed a consulate in Seattle. I just heard minutes ago, closed a reciprocal consulate in St. Petersburg for us. But it is an issue that we have to deal with, and it goes to the malign activities of undermining our basic values. And it is, I think, a major step forward for this administration to take this action. It's been under discussion for a long time, but I think it's finally time that we have done that. China continues to be a long-term concern relative to their aggressive reactions in terms of South China Sea and other places, but also their pursuit for gaining footholds in geostrategic places around the world. The One Belt, One Road China policy is targeting very key geopolitical locations around the world, and we see them moving in not only their investments, but also their military capabilities to these places. And that poses a challenge to us in the future in terms of modernization of weapons, nuclear capabilities, and others. Hopefully, relationships can be maintained with China so that we don't become the kind of adversarial position that we have with the North Koreans. Now, I could go on and on about threats around the world. I just presented to the Senate Intelligence Committee and to the public our annual threat assessment. As I said, many spots around the world fall in that category. And one predominant one is the issue of cyber. We have many adversaries there: nation states, non-nation states, criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, and kids in their dorm room who have the capabilities of hacking into a network and networks that provide for our security. This becomes an ever-emerging threat, and much needs to be done, in my opinion, to address that threat in ways that we not only provide good defenses to keep from being our systems intruded upon, but also to respond. That is an ongoing process that I think we're going to have to dedicate a lot of resources and a lot of time to address. And of course, we still have threats from terrorism and from those who want to take us down, but the threats they pose have been transformed by technology. All the threats that I've mentioned and many more have been transformed by technology. And let me give you an example. Think about the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan. When the Taliban regime was in power in Afghanistan in the 1990s, it was infamous for its draconian then ban on technology like television and radio. You mean you won't even let your people use television and radio, or you won't use television and radio because that doesn't fit your narrative. Today, the Taliban maintains a website and Twitter feed and posts videos of battlefield attacks filmed by their drones. These are technology advances that make threats more potent and much more unpredictable. And these capabilities fall into the hands of a lot of adversaries to the United States that want to take down our financial institutions, our electric supplies, our provisions, and any number of ways in which you can disrupt our way of life. So it is important and imperative that the intelligence committees and the intelligence people need to address these threats, and particularly address threats that are coming to us through electronic transmission. I was in Belgium for a NATO meeting. NATO set up a new intelligence arm, and so the 29 nations of NATO were together. And my Polish counterpart stood up and said, we've been talking about borders. We've been worrying about the borders countries to Russia, and it is a true worry. We need to be sincere about that worry. But he said, there really aren't borders anymore. They're not border countries. Cyber has eliminated borders. If you're a Portuguese, I look at my Portuguese friends, and I look at my Spanish friends. You're on the front line with cyber. You're a long way away from the border in the way terms used to be evaluated relative to the Russian threat. But right now, you're on the border. We're all on the border. And I think we need to understand that is true here with the attacks on our private sector, our state and local governments, and the general public. So, given all that, I believe we have no choice but to become more innovative and agile as an intelligence community. So over this past year, we've taken a comprehensive look at the intelligence community to determine where we need to go in the future if we're going to stay ahead of the game or even keep pace. What range of skills will be needed in the IC workforce? This is the question we're asking. How can we better understand the use of these new technologies? And how can we innovate and benefit from expertise beyond the IC? So we have identified a set of key initiatives for the community to pursue together. And we will start with the workforce because the people of the IC have always been our strength, and a few bad apples have been a real vulnerability. We will focus on how to recruit and develop the right expertise for the future, so we have a diverse workforce that includes the skills like data science and all those skills needed now for us to do our work. We need a trusted workforce, which means our security clearance process needs to be more effective and more timely. This is one of our top priorities. We are fully engaged in a total review and makeover of our security clearing process. As Senator Warner mentioned, we want a revolution, not evolution, but a revolution in terms of how we provide security clearances. We are hampered significantly in getting the talent that we need because it takes up to a year or more for young people with the skills needed and the desire to join us to get that security clearance. And it clearly is unacceptable. We can't ask them to wait around, these young kids with unbelievable talents, waiting around 12 to 14 months, working at food outlets to cover their cost until they can get their security clearance to take on a very, very important job. That is something we absolutely have to tackle. We put processes in place to do that, and we're going to achieve a much different look. There is some risk involved, obviously. You need to have the right information to hire the right people, but we surely can find a way to make this process much more efficient. We have identified a set of key initiatives for the community to pursue together, and we will start with that workforce because the people of the IC have always been our strength, and a few bad apples, as I said, have always been a real vulnerability. We're going to focus on how to recruit and develop the right expertise. We need a trusted workforce. We also need to be earlier adapters of technological advances as a source of strength and capability. Our focus on augmenting intelligence through machines will empower our workforce by applying artificial intelligence to our data. And additionally, we will seek partnerships to incorporate private sector capabilities, expertise, and insights. This can be difficult given private sector concerns about working with the intelligence community, but it's absolutely necessary if we are able to achieve what we need to stay ahead of the game. We have to work with the private industry. We're working with a clumsy, bureaucratic government that has to move law through a process that hasn't worked all that well lately in terms of appropriations and authorizations and the way in which we are set for a purpose. But we simply have to find a better way to handle all of that. But in the end, we have to find a way to benefit from cutting-edge technologies and a new private sector that approaches to our challenges. That is why we stop at Dell. That is why we visit Silicon Valley. That is why we look at the private sector in terms of how we can work together. We have to work through the legal process, but we've gotten significant response lately from the private sector saying, yes, we can be of help. We want to be of help. We want to be good citizens. We want to be patriots. We want to do what we can for our country. And we know we have the agility and ability to do things that government simply can't do. And to the extent that we can work together, we're getting very good responses now that we didn't get before relative to our work with the private sector. And finally, we need to recognize the need to make most of our data, which requires modern data management and infrastructure. Every aspect of our mission will benefit from these initiatives and none more than cyber. And these initiatives need to reach across the intelligence community. They won't look the same in each element, but our goal is that we move collectively toward these goals. And our goal is also there to position the entire community to meet tomorrow's challenge. Now, I believe in practicing what you preach. And so what we have set up is a reform a transformation of OD&I to eliminate our duplication, to become much more agile, to have fewer decision points, 4 deputies, a principal deputy, then reporting to the D&I, rather than nearly 24 entities that reported directly to the OD&I in the past. We're simplifying that process and looking toward a more modern management situation. We believe we need to clean our own house before we ask our communities to trust us in taking the lead to helping them do their reforms. Finally, as I told you, we are here to try to let the young people, the next generation, understand there is value in public service. And I've received some wonderful responses back from some really terrific young people that is under Steve's tutelage here relative to their interest. I promised them that it would never be boring. Public service has a purpose that you can't always find in the private sector. I told them they might not be as successful financially, although they will be successful, but maybe not as successful financially as if they went into the private sector. I told them that though when I asked people about public service, saying, you have all these skills, you could do that, yeah, but I don't have the purpose of getting up every morning and doing something for my country. The purpose of trying to keep Americans safe, the purpose of recognizing that Americans throughout generation after generation after generation have sacrificed for the future of our country. And that is worth more than money. That is worth more than a comfortable lifestyle. That is what has put an awful lot of people in this room, because they have said, yeah, that purpose is worth a lot. And whether you're in uniform or whether you're in a suit and tie or whether you're in a T-shirt these days with blue jeans working for the federal government, it is something well worth doing. And we're reaching out to young people to inspire them to do this. Bottom line is, we need them. These new technologies are more than some in my generation, starting with me, don't have a clue about. I walk into some of these organizations and they give me a brief, and I say, I think I got part of that, but I didn't get it all. And then I see these young people with these extraordinary skills. So we are in a time of generational change. The technology is changing. The young people seem to be attuned to all of this. I walk into my grandson's the room. My grandson's there with a computer. He's 5 years old. I say, "Hi, Charlie. How you doing?" Okay. Clicking away on stuff like I can't even get my phone going half the time. So, in any event, I want to close here just by saying thank you to UT. Steve, thank you for the program you put together. It has risen to the top. I think the participants in this room show the interest in it and what you've done. Hopefully this can be duplicated around the country. We have a lot to be proud of in this country, and looking to the new generation, which you say, what are they thinking? What are they doing? They're the future, and we're privileged to have them coming along. So it's wonderful to kind of combine what you're doing here with some updates on what's happening around the world. With that, I will close, and I think we're going to sit down and answer some questions.
Whichever one you want. There you go. Thanks. Well, Mr. Director, thank you very much for that. We appreciate very much your remarks. We appreciate you traveling all the way to Texas. We appreciate your expression of support for what we're doing here. It means a lot to us. We're trying to send some of the talent, some of the best talent here on the campus of the University of Texas and across the system to your community and to the federal government. So thanks for capturing that. Also want to thank you for coming back into federal service. You had choices. and you made one that required you to wake up pretty early every day, and we appreciate that. So, in preparing for our discussion, and the plan is, for those of you who haven't been briefed or didn't follow the schedule, we're just going to chat for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. I have a handful of questions, and then we're going to open it up for you. So there'll be a microphone coming around. Think about things you may want to ask the director. But in preparing for our talk today, I couldn't help but have a date jump out at me. It seems as though last week was your one-year anniversary.
It was.
Of your confirmation. Well, congratulations. No mean feat in this administration, and so thank you for doing that every day. And as you mentioned last night...
I'm still there.
Yeah. I know you scan the front page of the paper every day for that list. We're not hoping to see you on there. So you mentioned a little bit about the transformation and the restructuring. You and your fine deputy, Sue Gordon, rolled this out a week or two ago, and just wanted to poke around a little bit more in there. The one part of the announcement I found interesting was, and a very bold move on your part, apparently you went out and asked the other 16 agencies of the intelligence community what they thought of the ODNI. Okay, so would you be willing to share any of that with us? What did they say? What was the feedback? And then what are you trying to fix here?
I had a decision to make early on. Do we do it outside in? Hire Rand, hire McKinsey, somebody take a look at us from outside. There was some thought about the administration wanting to do that. I came to the conclusion that we ought to do inside out. We ought to put the trust in the people that we had. We ought to go to them and say, what do you think? This is the goal we want to achieve. Status quo no longer works, not in this threat situation, not with changing technology. So we have to change. How do you think we should change? What can you bring to the table? We were amazed at the response. The response was, we couldn't agree more. What we feared was somebody from outside would come in and basically say, do 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 12. And we had no participation in that process. And so what we ended up then with was putting something together that was embraced by the community. And when we released it to our auditorium of workers and others, we had support from all of those 16 agencies saying, yeah, we want to be part of this. How do we do it? And then we started putting pieces in place in terms of what we want to try to achieve. So I felt that was a much better way to achieve what we could achieve. As you saw across a number of other agencies, cut 25%, I don't care how you do it, cut 10%, I don't care how you do it, instead of clean the swamp, drain the swamp, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't think that was appropriate for the intelligence community or defense community, given the threats that we have.
Terrific. You'd mentioned in the early part of your response that there had been some whispers, some talk, which is, I guess, going around a bit in Washington about administration efforts, bring in outsiders, bring in some of their favorite insiders to take a hard look at the IC, and that scares lots of us, to be honest, those of us who spent our careers there. Do you think what you've done, this polling effort, the transformation announcement, the 100-day implementation plan, has that filled the space with respect to the White House and the administration? Are they satisfied that you've got the con on this, you're going to make the right changes, or do you think there's still some appetite out there for outside fixes?
I had to sell the idea. Yeah. I was successfully able to sell the idea, going all the way up to the president. And the White House is satisfied that we did the right thing.
It's terrific. Good to hear. You mentioned earlier in your remarks when you were describing some of the changes that you're looking at, the centrality, the importance of workforce development, right? Mm-hmm. It's the people, stupid.
It's the people.
You know? And so one of the most important aspects of that workforce development piece, or at least it was important to the members of the 9/11 Commission, which inspired a lot of this, and the members of the Congress that passed the law in 2004 that created your position, was this business of joint duty. You know the backstory, Goldwater-Nichols, 1986, defense reorganization, sort of break down some of the service identities, create a more unified fighting force. Well, there's a lot of that in the intelligence reform legislation now in the 1947 National Security Act. We've been at it now since 2005, so what's the math, 12 years now. Are you starting to see, do you think you have the right joint duty requirements in place? Are people getting the right mix of experiences? Have we created a joint intelligence officer yet?
I have to give credit to my predecessors for working through this process. They had a lot of hurdles to jump over. There was a lot of opposition to what we were trying to do. I was in the House of Representatives at the time Goldwater Nichols was implemented. Watched, then I served on the Armed Services Committee in the Senate and saw how that evolution took place relative to the effectiveness of that. And that now is our new defense component here with the rotational and so forth. And it was a success. And I thought that same model would work for us. I'm not the one that put it there, but I embraced it. I went out and sat down at lunch with people. How do you like this rotation? This is great. I mean, to be in one place for a whole career, it is so energizing and enlightening to come over to somewhere else and to see how they do it. I ask the people who come through OD&I, the narrative here was you get sent to OD&I and it's kind of like a dead end. It's just the opposite. Absolutely not. It has opened up my world in terms of what the IC does. And I love the idea of seeing the full picture of the other 16 agencies and what they do and how we interact with them in making my determination of where I'm going to go next. So I think it's worked well, and we're going to continue it. The people want it, and they accept it.
Good, thank you. I find that greatly encouraging because there have been times over the 12 years or so under OD&I's supervision where it's been maybe not prioritized as highly, a lot of exceptions given, and maybe not reaping the full benefits of it. So I'm happy to hear you embrace it.
Well, I think we also had to sell it to the oversight committees who had some reservations. I think we've been able to do that also. We have made some personnel changes, but they are happy. And we worked, by the way, working with the 16 agencies, we also worked through the oversight committees and their staffs. Here's what we're trying to do. We want to keep you informed of what we're doing, and they embrace that also. So we've kept the Congress engaged in our process, and it seems to be working.
Terrific. Thanks. Concept of the job. What I mean by that is, of course, you know the history, but for others, so in 2004, the Congress passed a law, Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, informed largely by the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission to prevent a future attack like that. Created your position. You were the fifth incumbent to be the Director of National Intelligence, but almost from the beginning, there was a pretty healthy debate underway about what is this DNI? Who is this person? What are their functions, right? So the 9/11 Commission itself referred to the head of a more unified intelligence community, borrowing a phrase from the military, unity of command, right? Then the Congress itself, when they passed the law, they described the head of a community who directed the spending of money, directed the intelligence community budget. First man to hold the job, John Negroponte, he used to like to say he was more of a coordinator than a director when he was challenged on this. That was his word. Mike McConnell, his successor, Admiral, he went back to President Bush and said, I don't have enough power. He said, I can't do the job. I've got more responsibilities than I have authority. Give me more power. I want to hire and fire people, right? He got some of that. Your predecessor, he liked integration. That's what he was all about and stuck with it. So when you think about it, I know you'll say all of them, but are you an integrator? Are you a unifier? Are you a coordinator? Are you the director? Are you a paymaster? What's your role here?
Well, it's like everything that comes out of Congress. Everybody kind of wants to get their equities in it, and that was obviously what happened with ARPTA. It had become clear that the director of the DNI was not the person who was going to direct operations. that responsibility was going to be left to the various agencies. What they did do, though, however, is give you budget authority. And, money talks, right? That can be a leverage, which we don't try to abuse. But all the agencies know that leverage is there. But out of it all, it has become a collaborative effort. The first thing I thought I needed to do when I took the job was establish a good relationship with all the directors of all the agencies. The past had been somewhat checkered relative to competition and who does what and who gets the credit and who isn't needed and so forth and so on. And there was a lot of resistance to the idea that there would be a coordinator at the top basically trying to pull us all together through an integration process. And so it was by looking at the history, I realized there were things I could do and things that I couldn't do. But what I came to the conclusion quickly was what I could do is try to establish the trusted relationships between me and the directors of the various agencies so that they could see my efforts not as telling them what to do through directional hiring and firing, et cetera, but through coordination and collaboration. I think we've successfully been able to do that. I pressed the idea of team. I said, if you look at the NFL game or even a college game here at the UT Stadium, you see a coach and you see about 15 assistants. The guy who handles the quarterback, the guy who handles the offensive line, defensive line, the safety, everybody's got their assistant coach. And I said, think of it in terms of we're a team. If you're a team, you've got to respect the fact that the coach can't run everything, that he has given a lot of leash to his assistants to get their job done. But if someone fails, we fail as a team. If we succeed, we succeed as a team. And I tried to use that analogy for the community, basically saying, let's not point fingers at who did the right thing or who does the most things or who goofed and who screwed up. We make a mistake, we made a mistake together. We get a success, we got a success together. Everybody has a piece of this. If we can stay as a team, we can get the product that we are obliged to get to the president and to our policymakers. If we're fighting among each other, it's a threat to the United States and the safety of the American people. And so I have been able to establish those relationships and then hire the right people. Whatever success I've had in my career, it's because I've gotten the right people in the right place, given them leash, and made them feel part of the team. And that's what I'm trying to do with the agency.
That's terrific. So you're the coach of this team.
Well,
I have to tell you, the football analogies have been used. Yeah. General manager, owner, star quarterback.
Well, Jim Clapper he said, you don't have the authority that you need, but if something goes wrong, you're going to be the guy that gets the hit.
So that's your role.
So
Pinata.
That's my role. The coach takes the hit, right?
Yeah. Yep. All right. That's terrific. Thanks. One of the principal functions that the 2004 law assigned to the new Director of National Intelligence, and it had been obviously transferred from the Director of Central Intelligence, who held some of these roles before, was his principal advisor to the President on intelligence matters. Now, that was understood at the time by the people who passed the law and by the last two administrations to mean essentially you own the current intelligence process, the PDB, the preparation and presentation of the presidential daily brief to the chief executive every morning, and then in turn you're the senior intelligence advisor to the National Security Council, member of the Principals Committee, and step into that role. Now, the experience with this administration was a little bit different, frankly, in terms of sequence, if nothing else. So they nominated a CIA director. He was confirmed first with the first group in January, several months before you were confirmed. And as Mike Pompeo told us when he was here last year, so he stepped in and wanted to make sure the president, developed an appetite for taking a morning intelligence briefing, and that's all for the good. Now Director Pompeo has been nominated to become the Secretary of State, and presumably he'll win that confirmation. Do you foresee anything changing now? You're on the job. Your team produces this morning product. The president now takes it, we're told, and benefits from it. In the Bush and Obama administrations, the CIA director wasn't involved, right, unless he or she was invited to, on an operational matter. So do you see any changes in the current intelligence portfolio, or are you sort of settled on, or more importantly, is the president settled on how it is today?
Given the gap between the time when Mike was first confirmed and took over, obviously the president wanted a role from the intelligence agency. With Jim Clapper stepping down right at the inauguration, there was this gap of time, and so I thought that was the right thing to do. Once I became confirmed, it was clear that I was going to head up the development and formation of the Daily Brief. Just 60 feet down from my office is the second most essential person in my team, next to my principal deputy, and that's the Deputy Director of Intelligence Integration. He is the one that is tasked to make sure we get the integrated product put in the PDB and then to our customers on a daily basis. So Ted and I work together every day, hours every day, in trying to work that process through. What are we going to say? What are we going to bring before the president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It has consumed a lot more of my day than I thought it would. I went back and looked at the history of the PDB. Every president has taken it differently. Some have read through and say, if I have a question, I'll call you. Others have said, give me 10 minutes or the top 3 things, and that's all the time I have for it. Others have said, I don't want to read it. Others have said, I want to read the whole thing. So I think I found early on it was important to how is the best way to get this information to the president in the way he wants to take it. And the way he wants to take it is he wants to have the intelligence people in the room, the major agency, obviously CIA. But I am in charge of that process. Almost think of it like, if you, again, a football analogy, you've got your announcer, and then you've got your color guy sitting right next to you, adding context to this. So basically, through a process which takes several hours to get where we want to get before we walk into the Oval Office, I walk in, Mr. President, today Ted's going to talk about this, this, and this, and then we can discuss this and so forth. And then he reaches out to the 3 of us, often plus the National Security Advisor, for our comments, context, and so forth. And that's the way the process has been ever since I arrived.
You foresee it continuing along the same line?
We anticipate continuing along the same line. Obviously, there's a confirmation process that's going to have to go on for the new CIA director. And so between then and now, it may be a little bit different than it is, but we want to go back to that because there are things that the agency does relative to covert and so forth that come up during this process, and they need to be addressed because the law authorizes covert decisions directly from, as you know, the CIA director to the president.
With information to the DNI.
With information to the DNI.
Exactly right.
Yep.
Thanks.
And that's part of the relationship. There has been some history between CIA and ODNI, history between CIA and DNI, but we've resolved that. We've got a great team put together.
Good. Thanks for that. A question on priorities. So one of what I think is amazing, or at least unique features of American intelligence, is that we're very strict about the policymaker setting the priorities, determining what's important, what information's collected, where the analytic effort is, which covert actions will be undertaken. And so the intelligence agencies themselves are not to be generating their own work or grading their own homework. They work for somebody. We stress in our classes all the time that customer service ethos, right? Support to the policymaker. So you've been on the job a year or so. Last December, the president issued his first national security strategy. It was unconventional in several respects, highlighted some national security threats that might not have been in predecessor documents, removed some that might have been prominent in the Obama or the Bush national security strategies. Do you have an example or a sense that any of this administration's priorities, they think about the world a little differently, see different things as security threats, has that migrated into your life, into your world, changed investment decisions, changed personnel and hiring decisions, different analytic priorities that are customized to this administration? Or do you think this looks like it did 2 years ago, roughly?
I can't exactly tell you how it looked like 2 years ago. Given the diversity of threats, which I mentioned in my remarks, we try to cover it from A to Z, thinking the president needs to have this information about what's happening around the globe. Clearly, though, there are focus points. And so each day as we're formulating or looking forward in terms of how we will structure the PDB and present the information, we want to try to assess what are the things that are most on the president's mind, most on the minds of our policymakers relative. Now, by being incorporated into the Principals Committee, both Mike and I, by being part of the whole NSC being part of that entity and working directly with them, we know what is being shaped up to be the sort of the strategy of this particular issue and where that's going. And so then we will try to direct the intelligence briefings relative to that so that the president understands this is going to be coming along. This strategy for Syria is being worked on up through the deputies, up through the PCCs, up through the PCs, and it's going to be coming and being brought to him. Therefore, I'm directing, let's focus more of the PDB, make sure every day, even though we give various things, make sure every day we have that focus. So, for instance, recently, of course, for the last many months, a lot of focus on the true hotspots: Korea, Afghanistan, Middle East, Syria, and then others. Yes, I guess it's a long way of saying, yeah, we do try to shape the PDB to make sure the president gets the amount of information he needs, given what he's thinking about or doing, or which foreign visitor is coming, et cetera.
So that's interesting. You're explaining you're using the PDB as the vehicle, as the vector for reflecting his interest and what you need to be on top of. It makes perfect sense. Right. Has that extended down to collection activities? So this is you identify something that's a persistent matter of high interest to the president, not going away. So you need to go turn the dials. We're going to need to know a lot more about this going forward, because some of this stuff takes time, as you know.
Yeah. No, it does filter down. I mean, obviously, we have collection capabilities that are over certain targets. And if we see one target diminishing and one target expanding, we think about how we might want to shift some of those collection capabilities. And North Korea is a perfect example. It was a hard target. It has always been a hard target. We realized early on that we had to shift a lot of focus there to see if we can penetrate that hard target, given the difficulty to a closed society, which we don't have the kind of capability that we have in other places.
Terrific. Thanks for that. You mentioned the worldwide threat testimony. Used to be, I think, sort of something that the intelligence community leaders didn't look forward to. I think root canals, a term I heard from time to time.
I actually look forward to it.
Well, that's where I'm getting at. So, a lot of us have changed our minds. You maybe never felt that way, but it seems to me, given the topic of our discussion this morning on legitimacy and transparency and public openness, a great opportunity for you and the other leaders to be up there in front of the American people, hear what's on your mind, hear what concerns you. Now, I know the first page of the written testimony tells us we're not supposed to pay any attention to the order in which these threats are presented because it doesn't reflect your assessment of their severity or whatever.
Perfect.
Whatever the words say.
That's exactly what we said.
Yeah. I know you don't mean it, though. And so, just as the last 7 years...
It takes an intelligence guy to figure that out, but he figured it out.
Connecting dots right here. Just like the last 7 years, your very capable predecessor, Jim Clapper, put cybersecurity at the top. Okay, so in our system of government, that's your job, strategic warning, right? The community's been doing it now for almost a decade, warning presidents, successive presidents, that cyber vulnerability is maybe the principal threat to our country and our prosperity. So do you have an idea on whether that threat has been accepted, acted upon? Why are we all so frustrated with the lack of a strategy, the lack of an approach, any sense that we're able to protect ourselves from a future cyber attack that your community has been telling us is coming? I know this is hard, but how do you think about it?
Well, I think a lot about it. I'm somewhat amazed that we haven't really... That issue has not really penetrated the public to the point where the demand on Congress, the demand on the administration, the demand on the intelligence community is, wait a minute, this is number one. Now, part of that is because you have the Korea issue, and that's nuclear, and that could be existential. And so there is obviously great concern about that capability and the threats that have been made and so forth, that I think has captured the attention of the American people. And I think too many of them still feel like, well, that happens to somebody else. Somebody else got hacked. Oh, that's awful. But it's not going to happen to me. But when you dig into it and look at the disruption that can be caused now by a totally different type of warfare, and I use the word warfare. Somebody said you shouldn't call it warfare. Well, there's a gray zone of warfare now that incorporates cyber, that can do things through cyber by the push of a key, the keyboard, be a major attack on our financial systems, on our electric systems, and on all the critical infrastructure, or individuals, their bank accounts and so forth, or their identities. And I think it's becoming much more aware, and the American people are becoming much more aware of the fact that, hey, we could be a victim of this. But I tell you, if there's two things that keep me up at night, it is the threat of any kind of nuclear exchange, which, if out of hand, is existential to a number of people that we don't even want to name the number. But secondly, a cyber 9/11 that would finally wake up the American people, finally wake up the Congress, finally wake up everybody and say, oh my gosh, how did we let this happen? Because all the warning signals have been there and are there, and they're increasing. And so that gray zone of, is this warfare, is this not warfare, what is the malign intent, and so forth and so on, needs to be more addressed, which is why I really stressed it in the ATA this year, thinking that we really need to pay attention to this. I think we're pretty quickly learning that, yes, we do, but there's still a large debate over defense versus offense, reception or response. And we're still trying to figure all that out, because we don't want a response then to trigger somebody else to do something that does turn into a 9/11 war, cyber threat. So I think that's something that the Congress and the executive branch need to work together with the support of the American people to really understand what is at stake here and what kind of policies are we going to put in place, not only to defend against it, which I think we've done pretty well, but to respond to it, which I don't think we've done enough of.
Well, thank you for being, refreshingly direct about that. You said when you were there in front of the Senate that we're under attack now, referring to the Russians and the upcoming elections. And so maybe by taking it directly to the people, that can stimulate the
I
response
wanted to
you're
try to
asking
get some
for.
attention. I got some criticism for that, but I wanted to get the attention, and the word attack, I think, got the attention.
Terrific. I could talk to you all afternoon. Would enjoy that, but we've got an audience full of people who got questions, I'm sure. This is your turn. Who do we have? Oh, Greg Treverton, one of our panelists. Yeah, let's wait, please, Greg. There's a mic working its way up. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Director. As a recent veteran of the ODNI, I can certainly testify that it was pretty plain that the director had too many people reporting to him and not enough deputies. So happily you fixed or set about fixing that set of issues. You've talked a little bit about Ted Gestaro and the Deputy Director for Integration, but I wonder if you could share with us your sense for the vision behind the other three deputies and their beats, how you want to use them to, I'm not sure what you're saying, coach the intelligence community.
Well, we're looking at, of course, the relationships both within the community, and that would involve also the Congress and the executive branch, but also our foreign partners and allies and other relationships. And so we have a sector deputy that would take charge of what we call partner engagement and working with the private sector, government, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, there's an administrative deputy that takes care of all the internal things that we have to do, from keeping the sidewalk shoveled and the parking garage open and everything that runs the whole management sector of that, the integration sector, and then the other. I don't know, what do we call? Jason, where are you? What do we call? How do we label that other that fourth one? Policy and engagement, but different than foreign strategy and engagement. So we try to put the people into 4 silos with 4 deputies that then report to the principal deputy, and then I will meet with them plus her on a regular basis, being brought up to me. Frees me up to, gives me significant time to focus in what I really think I need to focus on.
Just to quickly flesh out that sort of leadership structure, have you, in your interactions with the agency heads, there have been different structures for this? Are you going to have an XCOM? Are you going to have a periodic agency head meeting? How are you going to work with that constituency?
We helped develop this through the DEXCOM, and then we took it to the XCOM. So we incorporated the entire community into the process. Okay. Now, I can't sit there and say, so you need to do this too, but here's what we're going to do. We are happy to work with you in terms of how we came to this conclusion, and you can use this as a test model or whatever. So but they were all interested in it, and as I said earlier, we worked with them in formulating this, so they had a hand in it.
Right. Terrific. Christopher, you had your hand up.
Hi, Christopher Shafiq, undergraduate fellow for the Clements Center. Thank you for taking my question. Michael Morell said that the Russian meddling in the 2016 election was equivalent of a cyber 9/11. My question is, 1, do you agree with that statement? And then 2, what else can a cyber 9/11 look like? Thank you.
Well, I don't equate it as a cyber 9/11 because 9/11 took 3,000 lives and was more dramatic and demonstrative of an attack than cyber has been to this point. My worry is we will have a cyber 11 that might equate something or succeed something like that. But I do believe that this is something that we need to pursue. We took a major step just in announcing the retaliation against the Russians. We have held consistently relative to Russian influence, totally confirmed by the intelligence community and continuing. We haven't seen the kind of robust efforts they made in the 2016 election, but we are preparing ourselves for and trying to do everything we can to prepare ourselves for something similar than 2018. I convened a meeting with state and local election officials and our agencies relative to giving them information we have. DHS is working assiduously with the election directors of the different states. So we'll be much better prepared. I'm a big believer in exposure. I think the more we are able to tell the American people what is being done, the more aware they will be that just don't take stuff as gospel. It could be fake news. It could be, we need to verify this. My problem with our media today is there's no filter. There's no editor. Everybody has to, with all this competition between the cable networks and so forth, everybody wants to be first. And so when they get a piece of, quote, breaking news, although everything's breaking news nowadays, we got to get this out right now. We'll worry about the details later. And so stuff is coming out that people think, oh my gosh, what's happening? Only to learn later, well, that's really not what it was in too many instances. So being savvy, and I talk to students about this. When I talk to students, I said, look, a lot of stuff is being sent out there. Don't just take it at face value. Ask where it came from. Ask if it's been verified. Question it. Be a little skeptical about what you're being told. Don't let somebody tell you what's happening. Find out what's happening for yourself. So the more we can do that, the more exposure I think we can give to the American people relative to what the Russians are trying to do, the better. I was at this conference, I mentioned it, for conference in Belgium with the 29 NATO nations. And the new director for intelligence, who's a German, the intelligence component, said, now we've been talking about Russian influence. And, we've heard this from the United States and so forth. And we've seen it in Britain, we've seen it in France, we've seen it in Germany. But there's 29 of us. And we need it. I haven't heard any dissent from what we're going to issue as our consensus as to what the Russians are trying to do relative to undermining our values, democratic processes, elections, etc. So I wanted to just make sure, is there any of you of the 29 nations that hasn't seen this or doesn't agree with this? Feel free to dissent. That's okay. I thought 5 or 6 hands would go up and say, no, we've never seen that. They haven't bothered us, et cetera, et cetera. No hand went up. He said, do I take this as consent? Anybody? Okay, we're all in, right? All in. All 29 nations. So this thing that, it's just the U.S. is overreacting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is baloney. I mean, they're seeing it there obviously are attempts of the Russians to undermine our relationships, undermine our values, undermine our democracy. And the intelligence community said that from the beginning, and that's what it is.
We may have to translate that into intelligence analysis. More likely than not, baloney. Is that what you're intending to mean?
Yeah, I'm still working through all this.
William.
I apologize for asking what may seem like a charged question in these times, but what you just said and the reality in which at least I live are not in parallel. The fact that 29 countries have agreed that Russians meddled and meddle, which is, to state the obvious, different than collusion, and at least the people I talk to, what I hear, and what some politicians say out loud, those things are not the same. And my deep concern with the statement that people need to be skeptical, well, okay, that's fair enough, but average Joe citizen has no way to discover information on Russian collusion for themselves. So there is a time for expertise and looking to what our experts and government says. And how do we push back on this notion that something that you see on Facebook, which very well may be Russian-driven, by the way, is somehow morally or logically equivalent to what 29 nations are saying Russia is doing on a daily basis.
Well, I was obviously referencing what it was that, relative to the Russians' intent to do what they were doing. It related to meddling. It had nothing to do with collusion. I leave that decision to those who are undertaking the investigations relative to that, but to me those are two separate issues. The point I was trying to make is that we used to put trust and reliance on what we were told by the media. And unfortunately today the media, but usually when a reporter came up with something, it went to the editor then assigned it to somebody, say, verify, and then once verified, it came out. Now, that worked when you had one newspaper and 3 television networks. But right now, that doesn't work when you have 200 channels, and newspapers pretty much out of business, and they go electronically, and it's a competition. And I just think it's unfortunate that the American people aren't provided better access to the real news, what is real and what isn't, and what is fake. So that's the direction I was going in. I leave the other issues to those who are engaged in investigating this, and that's my role is not to engage in that.
Terrific. Claire.
Thank you so much. So of the 3 nation states that you talked about as being a threat, China, the DPRK, Russia, none of them are having meetings like this today where they're sitting down and talking about intelligence transparency. All have excessive state control that allow them to operate in much more shadowy spaces. So how does the most open and transparent intelligence community maintain an advantage over countries that have a lot more control of their intelligence operations?
Well, we really don't have that advantage that they have because we do try to find that balance between transparency and what we are doing and also guarding methods and sources and ways in which we think we need to keep the American people safe. So they don't have to go through that process of trying to find that balance. We do, and we should. Our Constitution provides rights to Americans, and among those are privacy. And so, as you know, we have taken many, many steps to try to achieve that balance, the latest of which was, again, modifications to the authorities, the so-called 702 authority, to address Americans' concerns about invasion of their personal privacy. So that doesn't give us it gives us an advantage in the long term as a country that respects the rights of their citizens. It doesn't give us an advantage from an intelligence standpoint relative to autocratic states that simply control their people.
And, sir, you should know this morning during the panel on legitimacy, there was a nice, healthy discussion on the Intelligence Community Directive that you signed out several weeks ago, re-endorsing the principles of transparency and reinforcing also civil liberties, privacy protection as a goal. We had a nice, healthy debate about that earlier. We have time for maybe one more. Let me check on Alex. Do you have one? Please. There's a mic over here.
Director Coates, Alex Vermooten, undergraduate fellow with the Clements Center. The theme of today's symposium is confronting 21st century challenges. And for many of the students in the room, myself included, this is the period we've grown up in, the internet age, the post-9/11 era. And it's heavily influenced our ideas and our scholarship. And as important as it is to look forward, we also recognize the value of looking back and learning from those who have come before us. So I wanted to ask if you could identify one or two lessons from history in your own experience or otherwise that we should keep in mind going forward. It's not just something that's relevant to our careers, but something that's essential to know as we navigate the national security field.
Well, that's a very good question. Thinking back over a lot of years, we as a nation which I think is on the same page relative to our respect for our rules and laws and division of authority granted to us by our founding fathers, can really slow things down and hinder where we might want to go. But achieving that balance where you can have counter checks on decisions made that can have major impact on our people is worth the confusion. Not the confusion, that's probably not right. It's worth the effort that slows us down in terms of implementing where we want to go based on spontaneous reactions. And so the checks and balances which our founding fathers put in place, and which I had to live through times many frustrations in the United States Congress relative, and which John has to deal with on a daily basis here, is very, very frustrating at times. How come we can't get things done? How come we can't push it through? You have to accept that we're bringing together different opinions and trying to find a consensus. The problem today is that we can't seem to arrive to that position. And unless people are willing to, I think, follow maybe the principle that Ronald Reagan laid out, if I can get 80% of where I want to go, that's a pretty good deal. Sometimes if you can get 60% or 51% of where you want to go, maybe you give some credit to the other side of maybe we wanted to go too far. Now, that's kind of a nebulous thing. I'm just trying to scratch my brain here about what specific incident has had the most impact on me in the past. But I think, well, clearly 9/11 was a game changer, at least for most of us in this room, I think. Some of the young people may not have been around at that particular point in time. But I think that was a game changer for this nation. And we've been dealing with and struggling with all the conflict and all the challenges that has resulted from that very day. Because now what we're dealing with is not just an adversary who wants to gain power. We're dealing with an adversary that has a totally different view of the world, a totally different ideology. It is based on a theology in many aspects. And you really can't turn weapons on a theology and defeat an enemy. And so I think we really are struggling here how to best find a resolution to the great gap between our theologies and the perverse use of those. I've said from the beginning, I don't think we can deal with this jihadist extremism because by killing people. We have to take those steps because they're killing us. But if it's going to change, that theology has to change, and that perversion of the Quran, the perversion it has put the world in a very, very complicated situation here. It's I think until the Muslims themselves, those that adhere to the true principles of the Quran and not use it for a perversive basis, until they step up, we're going to have to solve this. I don't think we can solve this problem through kinetic means. Doesn't mean we're not engaged, and we have to be engaged, but I think we need to factor that in terms of how we think about where we go. That's different than North Korea. This is, that's not an issue, but that's an issue that's put us in a situation since 9/11 that we haven't yet been able to resolve. So our issues in the Middle East, in particular, Afghanistan and so forth, are really tough ones to deal with.
Mr. Director, we want to wish you and U.S. intelligence the best. Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Mr. Director.